Hello listeners, you are tuned in to the program where we read and share thoughts from faith-based books. I am Joseph, the host of Christians Who Read Books. We are currently reading the book by Pastor John MacArthur, The Grace of God. Last time we considered chapter 1 of this book where he discusses what is God's grace. God's grace has been extended to those who are his enemies. This grace is unilaterally offered as a sovereign favor to us who have no qualifications and no rights. Now, in chapter 2, John MacArthur discusses how we receive God's grace. At a casual glance, it seems quite strange to be thinking about the how of receiving his grace. If God's grace is his unilateral and sovereign favor given according to his plan, how could there be a method through which we receive that grace? That's correct. There is no method to receiving grace. Since grace is something God gives unilaterally, there is no method that we can adopt to receive that grace. Nevertheless, Pastor MacArthur deals with the topic, how do we receive God's grace, in chapter 2. John MacArthur does not address how we receive God's grace by our actions, but he focuses on what kind of people received God's grace. This topic is explained in Luke 4:16 through 27. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And all spoke well of him, and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" And he said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself. What we have heard you did at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.' And he said, 'Truly, I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, where the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath, in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel, in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them were cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian." Through this passage, we can meditate on those that receive God's grace. Among all the people in the world, God chose Abraham and promised to give him grace. Through Abraham, the nation of Israel was born, and they received God's grace, being chosen among all the nations of the world. When some people like to argue against God, they would often say, "It is not right for God to send people to hell for not believing in Jesus." Or they might say, "It is unfair that only those chosen by God are saved." Before I met Jesus, I used to think that way also. However, after coming to know Jesus and learning about him in the Bible, I realized that such arguments are fundamentally flawed. The fact that only those chosen by God are saved is not about being fair or unfair. It is about God's grace. Because all people have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, they should all be subject to eternal damnation. We all deserve to be thrown into hell. Not because we didn't believe in Jesus or we were not chosen by God. We were all on our way to hell given our sinfulness and for being slaves to sin. But God provided a way to turn away from that path and turn toward His kingdom. Through Jesus, God provided the way. This is why we say Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Whoever believes in Him will be transferred from death to life, from hell to heaven. Therefore, God's grace is given to all. The issue is not about whether it is offered to some and not to others. It is about whether we want to receive that grace. The Israelites was offered the grace of being chosen by God, but they did not accept it. Why? Because they considered themselves righteous and believed that they could reach God's glory through the law given to them. They did not think they needed God's help. That's why in Luke 16-27, Jesus highlighted those that are non-Israelites as ones that received God's grace. He singled out the widow in Sidon and Naaman from Syria as the recipients of God's grace. Even though Jesus told the Jews in Luke 4 why He came to this earth, they did not believe or accept Him. Ultimately, God's grace flowed to the Gentiles who had no covenant but had faith. The widow of Sidon made bread for Elijah with her last grain, and Naaman dipped himself in the Jordan River 7 times in faith. God's grace is His unilateral and sovereign favor. He extends this grace to all people. However, only those who believe in God and long for His grace end up receiving it. We must examine ourselves if there is a thirst for God's grace within us. We must confirm that there is a faith in God within us. The grace of salvation is given to us because God loved us. Even though we were utterly unworthy of His love, He bestowed His abundant mercy upon us. However, God's grace is not forcibly given to those who do not want it. While we cannot attain God's grace by our works, we must avail ourselves to that grace when God offers it to us. What we can do is to look to the Lord and long for Him. We must have faith in Him. I hope that we all may experience the privilege of accepting and enjoying God's grace. This concludes today's session of The Christians Who Read Books. See you next week. Goodbye.